everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Farm Ed podcast. My name is Danielle and I'm the Public Engagement Coordinator here at Farm Ed, and I'm very excited today to be joined by a fellow soil enthusiast, earthworm nerd, Jed Soleiman. Hi Jed.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very, very happy to be here with a fellow soil and earthworm nerd.
Yeah, it doesn't happen every day, does it?
No, absolutely not. So I'm sure we can absolutely get into it.
Brilliant. So you're a soil scientist.
Yes.
You're doing your PhD at Oxford, and you're studying soil.
Yes.
What brought you here? What's been your background?
Yeah, no, it's been a bit of an interesting journey, I have to say. So I've always sort of known that I wanted to do something environmental. It was something I've always kind of aspired to, and I've always been acutely aware of the biodiversity and the climate crisis and the fact that we don't have much time to kind of do something about that. So I studied geography for my undergraduate degree, and that sort of allowed me to explore a whole breadth of different subjects that were to do with the environment and to do with our sciences. And I never really sort of at that time decided exactly what I wanted to get into and what really interested me. So I graduated in 2019, and I actually got a series of corporate jobs, which I quickly realised wasn't necessarily the right path for me. Before, like many people in COVID, I sort of reevaluated what I really wanted to do and what I found meaningful. And I actually applied for the Biodiversity Conservation and Management Masters at Oxford, and very fortunately got a place. So from there, it sort of spiraled. So I found a fantastic team. And I was very fortunately taken on by Professor Yvon Damali and his Ecosystems Lab team, which serendipitously at the same time he was setting up the Leverkusen Centre for Nature Recovery. And I really kind of just found a space there where I could explore all of these unique kind of interests where, as you know, as you said, there aren't that many people who are very interested in these things. So It was amazing to be in a space where there were so many people who were so interesting and appreciative and really lovely to interact with. And then I sort of didn't want to leave. It was a one-year master's and it was quite short. So I very fortunately got accepted onto the MPhil, which is sort of a halfway step to becoming a DPhil, which is what Oxford calls a PhD, which I very fortunately am now, and got some incredible funding from CHC ×3, so the Centre for High Carbon Capture Cropping, and working for Farm Ed and Cotswold Seeds now to investigate regenerative agriculture and its impact on soils.
Great. I mean, I find if we just take it back a step, I think it's really interesting that you went into this Centre for Biodiversity. What made you go down the regenerative agriculture route and the soil route rather than, I'm sure there's people doing amazing stuff in rainforests or planting trees or water. What specifically got you caught about or hooked on regen?
Well, regen is a fantastic sort of new frontier in terms of how we kind of look at the environment and interact with it. And it's not just from sort of an ecological perspective. So I very fortunately also have a training in social science, and I've always wanted to bring the social science into the ecology and all the other physical sciences I do as well. So regen sort of has all of these facets where it addresses the kind of key tenets of biodiversity loss and climate change, but at the same time is also about revitalizing communities and ensuring that we have thriving rural areas that serve lots of different stakeholders' needs. So I think regen is a really promising way forward in order to take, or a really promising way to achieve nature recovery, as well as lots of other kind of stacked benefits and goals for rural areas. So I see it as a really promising way forward. I hope that some of our investigations here will help shed light on those benefits.
Because what at Farm Ed we're trying to show is that it really starts with the soil, and that if we look after the soil, nurture it, make sure it's doing its job properly, then we see the benefits later down the line in the social circles. So, I mean, what are you researching here in the soils?
So specifically, we are currently understanding, firstly, how herbal leys could possibly give us carbon sequestration benefits. So we want to understand whether that diversity that we see in the herbal leys and the different rooting depths translates into building carbon, soil carbon over time, and understanding if that, for example, could be a way in which we help mitigate climate change. Simultaneously, we're also trying to understand the ecology of these systems. So we want to make sure that we're focusing both upon the climate benefits, but also the ecological benefits. And if we don't try and aim for both of those at once, we really won't find lasting, successful solutions.
Because often with science at the moment, I mean, you're much more in tune with it at the moment, but there is often one focus on carbon, and that's it. And we forget about the bigger picture of the whole biodiversity change. So yeah, it's really, really important what you're doing.
Absolutely. Carbon is a really important thing to be thinking about, and it's an extremely important story. And obviously, without arresting the climate, arresting all of the carbon being pumped into the atmosphere, we will have runaway climate change through the greenhouse effect, and that will have catastrophic consequences. But the problem with the carbonization, it was a new sort of term that we're coming out with, especially from our lab, the carbonization of ecology, is that it can place undue focus on certain elements of a system and try to inflate them, which doesn't necessarily create a stable structure where, if you think about ecosystems as complicated food webs of lots of interactions between different types of organisms, if you have only one specific group being emboldened, you're going to destabilize that overall web and not create something that actually is functional. So I think a really good example of this was a paper that came out recently arguing for the conservation and the increased population of whales, but only because whales have a really large body mass and that they're carbon fertilized. So the fertilization effect, essentially their excretion into the ocean fertilizes the ocean and draws carbon down. And that's a really noble endeavor. We really want to make sure that we're saving those species, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we are thinking about them as part of an entire system. And similarly, we want to ensure that we're doing the same thing for soils. So we want to make sure that we're looking at the entire system and how we can make sure that we're benefiting both the ecology that will keep that function going, so the nutrient cycling, the water cycling, all of these really important benefits and services that we need, but at the same time also store carbon.
Yeah, because I mean, I love that idea of a whale, because when you think of a whale, but then you think about a little nematode in the soil, you can't really get the scale is completely different. So have you noticed any specific interesting things in the soil you've been finding here, or
Yeah, I mean, we have been looking at macrofauna, so those are the larger kind of soil animals, and we found some amazing anisic worms here. So really, I know we're getting back into the worms, but some really large burrowing worms, so they're vertical burrowers. But also, because we're out at the moment, we've been finding a lot of millipedes in a state of torpor. So I thought that's really interesting.
What's torpor?
So torpor is sort of like a hibernation that they enter during the winter to try and conserve resources. So they'll sort of burrow into a dark and warm place and try and keep themselves there until temperatures sort of improve in the springtime. So we found lots of little millipedes curled up into balls, sort of just having a nice little rest. I think it's very sweet. It shows you the dynamic kind of lifestyles of a lot of these organisms, and how actually we attribute lots of these things as bugs and insects, but really they're very complex and they have incredible behaviours as well.
Yeah, because I guess the more that you're finding out about all of these amazing ecosystems in the soil, the less the more that we're... Sorry, I'll do it again. The more research you're doing and the more you're finding out through your experiments, are you realising the more that we don't know? Because I know soil, despite it being under our feet and we, brush it off every time we come in the house, we really don't know a lot about it.
Yeah, I think this hits a really important point, which is that soil has just been seen as sort of dirt for a very long time. It's a medium in which we grow things. It's a set of physical and chemical characteristics. But in reality, soils are alive and they're an entire ecosystem in their own right. So we need to be really understanding of all the different organisms and the biodiversity there, but because they are a physical black box, you can't peer into soils, we don't have anything that can scan or look through the structure, they're extremely difficult to understand. So it's a question of the more we look into these soils and try and apply kind of theories as to how we think they work, the more surprises keep getting thrown up. And I think the thing that sort of brought me into a lot of this, or one of the big surprises that really intrigued me, was the sort of discoveries around mycorrhizae.
Which could you explain?
Absolutely. So mycorrhizae are a soil fungus that forms a symbiotic relationship. So a relationship that usually benefits both plants and the mycorrhizae, the fungus. And they do that by growing very thin, long strands of hyphae, which they can either curl around a root tip or actually enter the insides of root cells themselves. And they'll form that relationship by foraging for resources for the plant that it needs, and the plant in return will deliver photosynthetic compounds to the mycorrhizae, like carbon.
Wow.
So what that really talks to me about, and especially if you consider the fact that plants can be colonized by multiple species of mycorrhizae at once, and those mycorrhizal hyphae form mycelium, so thicker strands that can then connect with other mycorrhizas and a mycorrhizal species. So it creates this sort of what has been termed the wood wide web. And there is definitely more research that needs to be done there to understand exactly what those dynamics are. But the fact that this underlines how much nature is actually also collaborating as well as in competition with each other, I think is a beautiful story.
Yeah.
And really allows us to kind of look at our ecosystems in a completely new way. And that's just one of many kind of stories that are being uncovered by looking into the soil and now studying them. And we hope that we'll be able to kind of shed some light at FarmEd on some of those stories around regen as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's just fascinating. We really haven't even scratched the surface on what's going on. I know that there are books just written solely about fungi and the amazing world that it is. So definitely check out those if you're interested in mushrooms and all sorts. So I know I have seen you working, and it's pretty hard graft,
Yeah.
it's fair to say. And your equipment is incredibly high tech. What kind of things are you taking out into the field, or are you taking back to the lab?
Yeah, no, I mean, so we sort of have a spectrum of really high tech to really low tech. And my personal preference is to try and keep things as low tech as possible so we can make sure they're sort of accessible and that other people can try things out that we're also doing. But some of the things we're doing does require some quite specialist equipment. So one of those activities is called soil respiration, and essentially is measuring all of the CO2 that the soil is outputting. And that gives us a proxy of sort of the metabolism or the activity of the soil and everything and everyone that's living in it.
So soil is breathing,
Essentially,
basically. That's
is what
pretty cool.
we're talking about
Yeah.
here. So by measuring those gases, we can start to see how those changes of activity correlate with seasons, with activities, with herbal lays versus chemically intensively farmed plots. And that is a really important measure. But we can also do other things where we have been collecting and understanding all the different soil animals, from the worms down to the bacteria and fungi. We're also looking at how much biomass, so how much growth do plants put on in comparison between those chemical landscapes and the regenerative landscapes. So in terms of their shoots and their roots, so there's a lot of digging involved. And we even go to something a bit less sexy. So we're looking at, for example, the dung of the wild animals that we find on the fields here. So we're able to incorporate their energetic. So we're able to incorporate their flows into our work as well. So there's a lot of different activities that we hope to bring together, and it's quite ambitious.
Yeah.
But there's going to be a lot of data that will hopefully give us a lot to think about and write about for specifically the kind of carbon sequestration potential and the energy flows going through all of those organisms. But I'm sure that we're going to find lots of unexpected things as well, which I'm really excited about.
Yeah, so that brings me on to my next question. What are you hoping that this research will achieve? Are you going to be talking to farmers about it, or hopefully policymakers? You know, where do you hope this research your paper will sit on someone's desk and they'll be able to pore over all your research?
Totally. I mean, I think that is a really important factor, and definitely want to be able to create outputs for other scientists and policymakers to use. But I've always been cognizant that a lot of papers get written and then put on desks and never looked at ever again. So I really like to engage with the communities that I'm working with and co-design a lot of the work that we do with those communities to ensure that we're meeting not only scientific goals, but also practical goals for people to actually utilize in their work. So there's going to be hopefully a lot of translation of this work to make sure that we can help people understand firstly what these systems are doing and maybe alter them in slight ways to make them more efficient at certain activities. But for me, my personal goal here is investigating routes to possible nature recovery in the UK. So a motivation of mine and sort of a lot of what my research is predicated on is understanding the different landscapes or the different land uses that we need in order to build a matrix. So lots of different types of habitats and food sources and niches for biodiversity to inhabit on the landscape. So one of those I think is rewilding, and is something that I've previously investigated in some of my work, which brings these large uninterrupted areas to help the biodiversity that needs really specialist resources. But regenerative agriculture can help connect those areas together and can also provide resources for more kind of generalist species who don't really mind too much where they are and what they eat. So those are two classes which I think will be integral to the future of nature recovery in the UK, and helping solve the dual biodiversity and climate crises. So that is one of the key goals here.
Great, and I think it's really important that you mentioned those two, rewilding and regenerative agriculture, because they often can be seen as completely different sides of the debate, but actually we're all trying to achieve the same thing. We all want nature to bounce back, biodiversity to be back to levels that it was before we came along and changed everything. So do you think that through your research, are there people, other Jeds doing research in the rewilding sector of soil and carbon capture?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question, and I think one of the reasons I was so keen to explore soils under rewilding is that there has been very little exploration of that topic. So we know the benefits that rewilding brings above ground, we can see it and we can very easily measure that, but if we don't ensure that we're also restoring soils, we're not going to create the physical basis for that cascade, so all of the other organisms who eat the plants who are connected to those soils and upwards to the predators, to actually create those, what I was saying before, long-term functional systems. So it's really important that we have those spaces and we investigate those spaces in such a way that makes us, or helps us really understand that actually rewilded spaces and places are viable for long-term nature recovery. And that's with the caveat that rewilding should only really take place in places that make sense. So we need to ensure that we're rewilding marginal lands and we're not taking really productive areas of farmland out of production. We also need to make sure that those rewilded lands are not devoid of people, because that's not what the countryside should be. And we should make sure that we're serving both the needs of nature and people in these places. So I think there's a lot of nuance that we need to sort of bring into that debate and really show how regen and rewilding can work together.
Oh, brilliant. I mean, and it sounds like Farm Ed is a pretty good place for that, because we do have areas on the farm that we have left for nature, but also the food that we are producing in the farmed areas we want to be really, nature focused and try and make sure we're looking after it. So I believe you're going to be talking to farmers about your research here, and we're going to help you disseminate all of that too. So
no, absolutely. So it's really important, and to me, to be able to kind of communicate and translate a lot of this work. And yeah, Farm Ed does provide that incredible space where we can not only have all of these different demonstrations of different regenerative activities, which helps us as researchers because it's much more convenient to just come to one place and be able to study lots of different things, as well as the fact that you guys have a control plot here, which is allows us to study the exact same system but under a different management technique on the same landscape and the same soil type and the same climate, which gives a really good comparison. But again, also those wild spaces and those areas that have been left allow us to explore how we can have those places exist in the same area, and really explain to people that, if you do leave these wild areas or these wildflower strips, you're going to get all of those predators for those pests that you might have in your crops come out, so you can use less pesticides, fewer fertilizers over time, and really stack those benefits. So we need to farm a bit more in relation and awareness to sort of the rhythms of nature, and do so in such a way where we care a bit less about how neat and tidy everything is on the farm. And actually those two principles will go a long way in helping us achieve a more sustainable future.
You've said it perfectly, thank you. So I know we've gone quite deep dive into the science and the theory and all of that, but if I didn't know anything about soil, or I was new to this and wanted to find out more, what's one fact that you could give me that would get me hooked and super, super excited about soil, like everyone should be?
I have one fact that I really like and really inspires me and just sort of blows my mind a bit. But 1 teaspoon of soil contains 1 billion cells and 10,000 species.
Wow.
So that to me is a mind-blowing.
That's more more than humans on the planet, right?
Well, not just. Maybe you need 7 teaspoons for that. But the fact that there's so much diversity and interaction and just things we have no idea about. I take DNA samples from soil to investigate different organisms, and we regularly can't identify over 50% of the things that we find.
Wow.
So, or more. There's a huge amount of biodiversity in different taxa, so different types of organisms, that we just have no idea essentially what the vast majority of them actually are. So I find that extremely exciting, and there's so many stories and different things to discover.
Brilliant. And if you could give any advice to a new young entrant into, I guess, research or farming or the regen world, could you give them any tips or tricks?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have to completely be honest and caveat that I grew up in a city. So I probably am not the typical person that usually kind of gets involved in this, but that's not to say that people who come from urban backgrounds shouldn't try and shouldn't do it. So something I found really valuable was actually getting a job as a regenerative farmhand last summer on the Knepp regenerative farm, and really learning the ins and outs of farming and what it means. But not only, again, the physical or the ecology, but the social and the political, and how we can, as scientists and researchers, best serve the needs of farmers. And I really think that that's the view that we need to be taking in order to work together. And I think another tip, so if you can, get some experience, try and kind of get to some of the farming conferences and talk to as many people as possible. But that's really the key for me, is networking, and just talk to people and build community and find people who are interested in the same things as you. And usually that's a pretty good catalyst to start things going.
Yeah.
So there are plenty of places out there, especially now there are places such as Emergent Generation for people to get involved with, to start foray into sort of the farming world. But just talk to people.
Brilliant. Well, we've had a lovely talk with you, learnt more about soil than I know before. So thank you very much, Jed, for having us.
No, thank you very much for having me on.